The Radcliffe estate sat like a sleeping lion atop the hills, a fortress of polished stone and silent wealth. Its marble columns gleamed beneath the early light, and the air itself seemed perfumed with old money and prestige. Inside, Ethan Radcliffe stood before a full-length mirror in the foyer, adjusting the knot of his charcoal tie with practiced precision. At 43, he was the embodiment of discipline. Tailored suit, steel blue eyes, a jaw that rarely softened. Every motion was deliberate, controlled, necessary. Behind him floated the figure of his wife, Celeste, her silk robe whispering as she passed. She held a crystal glass of orange juice with the casual grace of someone born into elegance. "Don't be late for the investor call," she said with a sly smile, brushing his shoulder as she moved toward the sunroom. Her voice was warm but distant, like music played from another room. Ethan watched her disappear down the hallway, a shadow of something he couldn't quite name settling in his chest. Something had changed in her. He had noticed it for weeks now. The way her laughter rang hollow, the subtle shift in her posture when her phone lit up. He'd dismissed it all. People changed. Marriages weathered seasons. But today the unease was louder. He shook it off, grabbed his briefcase, and made his way to the side entrance, where the chauffeur always waited. But when the heavy oak door opened, Ethan didn't step forward. He stopped. His polished shoes hovered just above the threshold. His gaze locked on something. Someone, standing motionless in the morning shadows. Little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6, though her eyes said otherwise. She stood barefoot on the stone landing in a faded gray dress and threadbare apron, one hand gripping the handle of a dented metal bucket, the other resting at her side as if uncertain whether she was allowed to exist there. Her skin was dusted with the memory of last night's wind. A scarf wrapped her braided hair, and in that early light, she looked more ghost than child, except for the way she stared straight at him. Not with fear, not with awe, but with something far heavier. The housekeeper arrived behind him, huffing slightly. "She shows up now and then," she muttered. "Never begs. Probably hungry. Harmless." But the girl, whose name Ethan didn't know yet, didn't look at the housekeeper. Her eyes, dark and steady, remained on him, as if she had waited specifically for him. He stepped forward, crouching so their eyes met on even ground. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She looked down for a heartbeat, then back up again. "Nina." Her voice was soft, too soft for the weight it carried. Ethan offered a small nod. "Do you need something? Food?" She shook her head, then breathed in. "I came to tell you something." The air shifted. Ethan tilted his head, unsure if he'd heard her right. "What is it?" Nina took a step closer, metal bucket brushing the stone. Her eyes darted toward the tall hedges that separated the estate from the garden, then returned to his face. She lowered her voice to a trembling whisper. "Your wife is lying to you." Ethan blinked. The breeze no longer moved. Everything went still. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. Nina gripped her bucket tighter. "Last night I was behind the garden wall. I sleep there sometimes. Saw her. Through the window. She wasn't alone. There was a man. Not you." His heart thudded. "Are you sure?" They were laughing, whispering. "She said something about you being gone soon. She said she was almost free." The words fell like stones in a well, echoing deep inside Ethan's chest. He stared at her, searching for signs of deceit, some hint of playfulness or fantasy. But Nina's face remained still. Her eyes were wide but calm, filled with a solemnity no child should carry. There was no mischief in her voice, only quiet truth. From inside, Celeste's laughter drifted down the hallway, perfectly timed, painfully hollow. The same laughter he had once loved. The same voice that now rang with suspicion. Ethan's throat tightened. He looked back at Nina. "Why are you telling me this?" She lowered her gaze, speaking so softly he had to lean in. "Because people don't believe girls like me. But I see everything." And with that, she gave a small nod, turned, and walked barefoot down the stone path. The metal bucket bumped rhythmically against her side like a clock ticking toward something Ethan could not yet name. He watched her go, unable to move. His entire world, this house, this life, this perfect illusion, had been brushed by the fingertips of a forgotten child, and it trembled at her touch. He had no reason to believe her. No evidence. No logic. Just a girl from the shadows with nothing to gain and everything to lose. And yet somehow he believed her. That night, the silence inside the Radcliffe estate was louder than ever. The fire crackled softly in the hearth of the master bedroom, casting flickering shadows across the velvet drapes and carved mahogany walls. Celeste sat at her vanity, brushing her golden hair with slow, practiced strokes. Her silk robe shimmered in the dim light, her perfume, soft jasmine and something colder beneath, hung in the air like memory. To anyone else, she would have looked ethereal, untouched, trustworthy. But Ethan stood near the balcony doors, his back to her, and all he could see now was the echo of Nina's voice. She said she was almost free. He closed his eyes and felt the words crawl beneath his skin, burrow into the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Doubt was no longer a quiet whisper in the back of his mind. It was a living, breathing presence inside him, pacing restlessly, demanding to be acknowledged. Celeste hummed as she applied lipstick, unaware, or pretending to be, that her husband hadn't spoken since dinner. Ethan turned his head slightly, watching her reflection in the glass door. She smiled at herself, but there was no warmth in it. Only calculation. Or maybe he was imagining it. Was he? He hated this. The not knowing. The haunting space between truth and suspicion, where love could rot if left too long. He remembered their early days, when every touch meant something, when every silence between them was filled with mutual knowing. Now that silence stretched like a void, and he didn't know what lived inside it anymore. He couldn't sleep. Long after Celeste had curled into their shared bed, her breathing slow and even, her arm draped effortlessly across the empty space between them, Ethan sat alone in his study. The walls here smelled of old leather and ink, of power sealed inside contracts and oak bookshelves. He lit a single lamp and stared at the dark monitor on his desk. The estate's internal security server. He had never used it. Not once. It was installed years ago. Part of a paranoid consultant's checklist. But this morning, a barefoot child had looked him in the eyes and told him something he could not forget. And now, in the quiet ache of midnight, he was going to find out if the world he lived in was real, or already gone. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard. For years, he trusted everyone inside these walls. The butler, the chefs, the woman lying in his bed. What did it mean to open this door now? What would it cost? He entered the credentials. The screen flickered to life. Rows of footage. Hallways, gardens, back corridors, rooms unused for months. He moved quickly. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't breathe until he knew. He scrolled through timestamps, narrowed in on the northeast corridor near the garden wing. The wall Nina had mentioned. It was barely visible in most frames, just a blur of shrubs and ivy. Then at 1:47 a.m., movement. His pulse quickened. Celeste, wearing a silk robe, her hair loosely pinned. Moving quietly, deliberately. She looked over her shoulder once, as if listening for footsteps. And then, another figure emerged. Well, familiar. Ethan leaned forward, heart now pounding like thunder. Edward Crane. His business partner. They walked together toward the glass-walled solarium. There were no obvious embraces. No kisses. But something about their bodies, the nearness, the ease, the unspoken words between them, felt like betrayal written in silence. Ethan activated the audio logs. Static at first. Then whispers, laughter. And then her voice, clearer than a blade. He's almost done. He's been moving funds into the Zurich account. Soon we won't need him at all. The room went still. Ethan stared at the screen as though it had slapped him. Her voice kept playing in his ears even after the audio cut. We won't need him. He felt it all at once. The collapse of memory, the rewriting of every gesture, every smile, every time she had told him she loved him while inching closer to a man who was helping her undo everything he'd built. A slow sickness rose in him. Not anger, not even heartbreak. Something colder. Hollowing. He stood, backed away from the desk like the footage might burn him if he looked any longer. For a moment he pressed his hands to his face, not to hide tears, but to steady a storm. Nina had seen it. The child in rags. The child nobody believed. She had come not for food, not for favor, but to warn him. He turned away from the screen and stared out the tall windows. The night stretched beyond the glass, stars scattered in a cold sky, wind curling through the hedges. Somewhere out there, Nina was sleeping alone with nothing but a dented metal bucket and a truth heavier than anyone her age should ever have to carry. Ethan knew what had to come next. But first, he had to gather his silence, turn it into action, and let his doubt become clarity. The storm had erupted. And now, it was time to decide what would be left standing after it passed. The truth didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It seeped in slow, invasive, like water finding every crack in a foundation he thought was unbreakable. By dawn, Ethan stood motionless in the garden, his breath fogging in the early morning chill. The hedges rustled in the breeze, and dew clung to every leaf like tears the earth itself had shed. The world felt alien now, repainted in a palette of betrayal. What had once been his sanctuary now felt like a stage, carefully arranged, meticulously rehearsed. He was the last to know the script had changed. He didn't return to bed. Instead, he watched the sun rise over the estate he no longer trusted. Somewhere inside those walls, Celeste lay in the same sheets they had shared for years, her body still warm with the lie she had whispered into Crane's ear just hours before. Ethan had spent the remaining hours of the night verifying what the footage suggested. Accounts linked to his name, drained in slivers over the past year. Shell companies routed through Luxembourg. Layers of silence stacked like armor over a conspiracy he had been too blind, or too trusting to question. But the footage wasn't the worst of it. It was the audio from 2 weeks ago. She had laughed. Not gently, not nervously. She had laughed like cruelty was currency. Crane had spoken of the girl in vague tones, but Ethan now heard the subtext, clear and glinting like glass in sunlight. Nina wasn't some passing anomaly. She was evidence, a crack in the floorboards. And Celeste had known. That realization gutted him more than the financial betrayal. That she knew. That she had seen a child abandoned in their own shadows and not only allowed it, but counted on no one noticing. He remembered Nina's eyes, wide and steady. She hadn't flinched, hadn't begged. She'd simply warned him. That kind of courage didn't come from nowhere. Came from surviving something. From watching adults lie with clean hands and polished smiles. By the time Celeste entered the breakfast salon, Ethan was waiting. His hands rested lightly on the linen-covered table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched before him. She wore ivory silk again, the color of innocence. How fitting. The faintest smile curled her lips as she reached for a croissant, oblivious to the fracture in the air between them. Then she looked up and paused. Something in his face. Something too still. "Didn't sleep?" she asked softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I watched footage from the solarium," he replied. Measured, like he was stating the weather. Her fingers froze mid-motion. The silence between them stretched taut, like a bowstring about to snap. She tried to recover, tried to smile. "Darling, if this is about Edward." "It is," he said, standing. "And it's not. It's about the girl too. The one you let hide in our walls. The one you fed just enough to keep silent. The one who saw more than either of us expected." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes flickered, calculation returning like an old instinct. He saw it, the switch from surprise to strategy. "She was never in danger," Celeste said finally. "We were monitoring her. She had nowhere else to go. We showed mercy." Ethan's hand hit the table. Not loud, not violent, but final. The coffee spilled, darkening the white cloth like a stain that would never wash out. "Don't use that word," he said. "Mercy isn't feeding a child in secret while plotting to erase everything that stood between you and a bank account." Her face hardened. "You think you know everything now? I know enough." She rose then, a queen stripped of her court. "You don't understand what it's like to be powerless in a room full of men who think your beauty is the only currency you own. Crane offered me something you never did. Control. And you paid for it with my trust," Ethan said. Silence. Then softer, almost broken, he added. "And you sacrificed a child's safety for a clean exit." For the first time she faltered. The mask cracked, not shattered but fissured. She looked away, toward the window, as if hoping for a different horizon. But there was no horizon left. Later that day, Ethan called a private investigator he once worked with before his fortune hardened him. The kind of man who knew where lost children ended up. The kind of man who didn't ask questions with easy answers. Nina was gone. Vanished at first light, the old metal bucket left by the garden gate. A folded note tucked inside, written in pencil on the back of a blueprint. "You believed me. That's enough. I'll be okay. Just don't let her win." He read the note a dozen times. He didn't cry. He just closed his eyes and pressed the paper to his chest, as though it could tether him to whatever remained good in the world. The truth was out. The illusion had shattered. And now the only thing that mattered was honoring the one voice brave enough to speak when no one else dared to listen. The mansion stood quiet, as if it too had stopped breathing. Days had passed since the confrontation. The staff still moved through the halls, but lighter now, like ghosts afraid to disturb the air. No words had been spoken between Ethan and Celeste since that morning. None were needed. Everything that could break between two people had already shattered. Trust, memory, even the shape of silence itself. She had moved to the south wing. He stayed in the study. They ate alone. They slept apart. They no longer argued. What was the point of arguing when the war was already lost? Ethan found himself watching the places Nina had lingered. The corner near the service stairs, the old tool shed behind the hedge, the loose stone in the east garden wall. These weren't locations, they were imprints. Tiny memorials. She had left no pictures, no possessions. Just the dent in the metal bucket and the way the wind now carried a kind of absence through the trees. He didn't try to chase her. He knew she wouldn't be found unless she wanted to be. Nina was the kind of soul that didn't run, she disappeared. Vanishing wasn't a surrender. It was her form of survival. But Ethan hadn't forgotten her words. "You believed me. That's enough." And so he believed her still. He began the process slowly, quietly. No headlines. No legal announcements. He transferred shares out of Crane's reach, severed ties under silent cover, rewrote contracts in his own name. He visited Zurich and shut down the offshore accounts, not in fury, but with precision. Every move he made was calculated. Not revenge. Restoration. The truth didn't need drama. It only needed weight. Crane vanished from public life 2 weeks later. Celeste never asked about him. Maybe she knew. Maybe she didn't care anymore. She moved through the house like someone rehearsing for a role that no longer existed. She wore the same pearls. She still painted her lips in rosewood red. But her voice had lost its tempo. Her eyes no longer danced. And Ethan. He didn't punish her. He didn't shout. He didn't even look at her with disdain. He simply became unreachable. That was his answer. Not a verdict, not a sentence. Just absence. Like a door gently closing in a room no one would ever enter again. Some endings don't come with final lines. Some arrive like fog. Soft, soundless, irreversible. He left the estate the morning after the first frost. The lawn sparkled in white silence as he stepped into the back seat of an unmarked car. No suitcase. Just an old leather folder tucked under his arm. The one containing Nina's note and a photograph of a house halfway across the country. A place he'd bought in a quiet town where no one knew his name. Where trust wasn't currency. And kindness didn't need a witness. He didn't tell anyone he was going, not even the staff. By the time Celeste wandered into the breakfast room, he was already gone. The chair he always used sat perfectly pushed in. His mug was empty, his scent gone from the air, and still no note. Because sometimes the only justice is departure. Sometimes the cleanest ending is the one without apology, without confrontation, just space. He didn't leave to forget. He left to begin again, with the silence Nina had trusted him to hold. And in that silence, everything that mattered remained. The house stood at the edge of the valley, modest in its bones but bathed in the soft amber of a forgiving sun. It was nothing like the Wexford estate. No marble, no chandeliers, no curated perfection. Just wooden beams, a weathered porch, and the gentle hush of trees that swayed like they were whispering second chances. For Ethan, this wasn't an escape. It was a return to something he didn't even know he'd lost. Took weeks to adjust. The silence was no longer heavy. It was honest. He woke to birds instead of boardroom calls, brewed his own coffee instead of being served, and for the first time in years, he watched the sky without wondering what it cost to own the land beneath it. But there was still one piece missing. One name that echoed in his mind like a promise unfinished. Nina. He had people look, gently, respectfully. No pressure, no orders. Just an open question whispered across networks of kindness. If you find her, tell her. There's room here. He didn't expect anything. He only hoped. Then one morning, just as spring began to stretch its fingers across the hills, she appeared. She didn't knock. She stood at the fence, same quiet posture, same old bucket in her hand. Her clothes were better now, not torn but still simple, and her hair was tied back with the same kind of cloth, only newer. Her eyes were older, not in years but in knowing. Ethan stepped onto the porch slowly, not wanting to scare the moment away. I wasn't sure if you'd come, he said softly. She didn't speak, just watched him. Then after a beat, she lifted her chin and asked, Do you still believe me? His answer was the kind that needed no time. Always. That was enough. He opened the gate and let her walk through. She didn't run. She didn't smile. She simply entered like she belonged because in truth, she always had. The days that followed were gentle. He gave her a room, not a guest wing, not something gilded or distant, but a space painted in soft blue, with shelves waiting for books, and a telescope already assembled by the window. She didn't ask for anything, but when she saw it, her face, usually so still, broke into something between awe and fear. Like joy was too fragile to touch. He cooked. She learned. They talked little at first. But then came the laughter, the small, genuine kind. She loved pancakes. She hated tomatoes. She named the stray cat who showed up every week Captain Waffles, and insisted he had opinions about everything. Ethan didn't ask her about the in-between time, where she'd been, who she'd trusted or feared. He knew that if she wanted to tell him, she would. Until then, he gave her the thing she needed most, peace without condition. Seasons passed. The valley turned green, then golden, then soft with snow. They planted herbs in the backyard. She read aloud on rainy afternoons, sometimes stumbling over words, sometimes inventing better ones. He began writing again. Nothing for profit, just thoughts, letters to a world that finally made sense through smaller things. They celebrated her birthday under a sky bursting with stars. No guest, just a cake, a single candle, and a necklace with a tiny star engraved on it. He placed it around her neck without a word. She didn't cry, but she held his hand for a long time afterward, and that was more than tears could ever offer. Eventually papers were signed. Nina Solin became Nina Alden. No ceremony, no speeches, just 2 signatures, a quiet nod, and a walk through the field where fireflies flickered like tiny beacons of all the life ahead. It wasn't about saving her. It never had been. It was about meeting someone who reminded him what truth looked like when the world forgot it mattered. And for Nina, it wasn't about being rescued. It was about being seen, finally, not as someone in the shadows, but as someone worthy of light. They didn't rewrite the past. They simply stepped into a future that didn't owe them anything, but offered everything. Together, not as millionaire and orphan, not as broken man and forgotten girl, but as two souls rebuilt by quiet courage, and the kind of love that never needs to be spoken to be known.